The security camera footage was crystal clear. Margaret Henley, HOA president and neighborhood tyrant, directing a cement truck into Danny Morrison's backyard at 3 a.m. What she didn't know was that Danny's pool wasn't just any pool, it was sitting directly over the main water line that supplied the entire Willowbrook subdivision. One petty act of revenge was about to turn into a $2.3 million disaster that would expose decades of corruption, destroy lives, and prove that sometimes karma doesn't just knock. Danny Morrison stood in his backyard, coffee mug trembling in his hand, staring at what used to be his pristine swimming pool. Where crystal blue water once reflected the morning sun, now sat a grotesque monument of gray concrete, still wet and steaming in the humid Florida air. What the hell? The words came out as a whisper, but the rage building in his chest was anything but quiet. His phone buzzed. A text from his neighbor, old Mrs. Chen. Danny, I'm so sorry. I saw the cement truck at 3 a.m. but thought you were doing construction. I have it on my security camera if you need it. Danny's hands shook as he typed back, send me everything. Now. The video arrived within minutes. Even in the grainy night vision footage, there was no mistaking the figure orchestrating the operation, Margaret Henley, HOA president and self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates. Her bleached blonde hair was pulled back in that signature tight bun, her angular face twisted with satisfaction as she directed the cement truck driver with theatrical gestures. You destroyed the wrong pool, Margaret, Danny muttered, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that would have made his ex-wife nervous. But Sarah was 3 states away now, probably relieved she'd escaped before witnessing what was about to unfold. The doorbell rang with the aggressive persistence of someone used to being answered immediately. Danny already knew who it was. Margaret Henley stood on his front porch like a conquering general, her HOA badge gleaming on her blazer, clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. Behind her stood Todd Brennan, the HOA's so-called enforcement officer, a 40-year-old man-child who'd never held a real job but had found his calling in measuring grass heights and issuing citations. Good morning, Daniel, Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I trust you've discovered our little surprise by now. You mean the felony destruction of property happening in my backyard? Danny kept his voice level, but his knuckles were wide around the door frame. Margaret's smile widened. Oh, honey, that's not destruction. That's enforcement. Section 4.7 of the HOA Covenant clearly states that any pool deemed unsightly or not in accordance with community standards can be remediated by the board. Remediated? Danny's laugh was harsh. You filled my pool with concrete at 3 in the morning like some kind of mob hit. We gave you ample warning, Todd chimed in, consulting his clipboard with the seriousness of a Supreme Court justice. 3 citations over the past month. The pool had algae, Daniel. Algae? Do you know what that does to property values? Danny stared at them both. The algae had been from a broken filter, a part that had been backordered for weeks. He'd explained this in writing, with documentation from the pool company. But Margaret had wanted this fight from the moment he'd refused to vote for her proposed $500 monthly HOA fee increase. You want to play games, Margaret? Danny stepped onto the porch, forcing both of them back. Fine. But you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. Are you threatening me? I'm promising you. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd never heard the name Morrison. Your idle threats don't scare me, Daniel. I've been running this community for 8 years. I know every rule, every regulation, every bribe. Danny's voice cut through her speech like a blade. Every kickback. Every under-the-table deal with your contractor buddies. The color drained from Margaret's face. Todd shifted nervously, suddenly finding his clipboard fascinating. I don't know what you're implying, Margaret said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. See, Margaret, you made one crucial error. You assumed I was just another suburban dad who'd roll over and take it. But you never asked what I did for a living before I retired. Danny could see the wheels turning in Margaret's head. She knew he was divorced, knew he'd moved to Florida from Chicago, knew he paid his HOA fees on time and kept to himself. But she'd never bothered to learn that Daniel Morrison had spent 25 years as a forensic accountant for the FBI, specializing in financial crimes and corruption cases. "What are you talking about?" Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm talking about the fact that for the past month, while you've been harassing me about algae, I've been digging into the HOA's financial records. Amazing what you can find when you know where to look." Margaret's face went from pale to ash gray. "Those records are confidential. Not when they are submitted to the state as public documents. Did you know there's a 3-year lag in the system? Your 2021 financials just became available last month." Fascinating reading. Todd was backing away now, sensing the shift in power like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. But Margaret held her ground, her jaw set in defiance. "You're bluffing." Danny smiled, and for the first time in months, it felt genuine. "Riverside Construction. Ring any bells? They've done almost every emergency repair in this neighborhood for the past 3 years. Funny thing is, they don't actually exist. The business license was registered to a P.O. box in Clearwater, and the bank account belongs to one Margaret Elizabeth Henley." The clipboard slipped from Todd's hands, clattering on the porch. "You embezzled $847,000 from the HOA over 3 years, Danny continued, his voice steady and professional. "You created fake companies, submitted fraudulent invoices, and pocketed the money. And yesterday, you decided to pick a fight with the one person in this neighborhood who could destroy you." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Finally, she found her voice. "Prove it." Danny pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. "Already have. I filed a complaint with the state attorney general yesterday morning. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit should be here by noon." Margaret's perfect composure finally shattered. "You son of a bitch. You think you can just waltz in here and what? Expect honesty from my HOA president? Expect not to have my property destroyed because you're a petty tyrant with a Napoleon complex? I'll sue you for defamation." "With what money?" "The $847,000 you stole." "Because that's frozen as of about an hour ago." Margaret's face contorted. With rage. "You have no idea what you've done. This neighborhood, these people, they depend on me. I keep this place running. By stealing from them. By making the hard choices. By keeping property values up and keeping the riffraff out. You ungrateful Margaret." Danny's voice was quiet now, almost gentle. "You're done. It's over." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Margaret's composure cracked completely. "You want to destroy me? Fine. But you have no idea what you've just unleashed." She turned and stalked off the porch, Todd scrambling after her like a kicked dog. Danny watched them go, satisfaction warming his chest. He'd spent 25 years taking down financial criminals, and Margaret Henley was about to learn that retirement hadn't dulled his skills. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Morrison, this is Agent Sarah Chen, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We need to talk. Can you meet us at the field office in 2 hours?" Danny was typing his response when he heard the first rumble. He looked up to see a massive excavator turning onto his street, followed by 2 dump trucks and a crew of workers in hard hats. His phone rang. "Mr. Morrison. This is Bill Crawford from Emergency Water Services. We've got a problem. That concrete in your pool, it's compromised the main water line. We need to excavate immediately or the whole neighborhood loses water." Danny looked at his concrete-filled pool, then at the army of machinery rolling down his street. "How much damage are we talking about?" "Well, sir, we are looking at about $250,000 in repairs, minimum. Maybe more if we hit the gas lines underneath." Danny closed his eyes. Margaret had wanted to play hardball. She just turned a neighborhood dispute into a federal case and an infrastructure disaster. "Do what you need to do," Danny said. As the excavator's engine roared to life, Danny caught sight of Margaret's face in her front window across the street. Even from a distance, he could see the realization dawning on her features. The war had begun. And Margaret Henley had just discovered that sometimes, when you try to bury someone, you end up digging your own grave. The excavator's bucket bit into his lawn and Danny smiled grimly. By the time this was over, his backyard would indeed look like a war zone. But Margaret's entire world was about to become one. The FBI field office in Tampa buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that Danny remembered from his working days. Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to his neighbor, was younger than he'd expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and the kind of focused intensity that came from years of hunting financial predators. "Mr. Morrison, your preliminary documentation is impressive," she said, spreading files across the conference table. "But I need you to understand what we are dealing with here. This isn't just HOA fraud. Based on your evidence, we are looking at a RICO case." Danny leaned back in his chair. "RICO? That's organized crime territory." Margaret Henley didn't work alone. "We've been tracking a network of HOA officials across 3 counties. They've been systematically looting community funds, but they got sophisticated about it. Shell companies, fake vendors, kickback schemes that span municipal governments." Agent Chen pulled out a photograph, a surveillance shot of Margaret shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit outside a country club. "Recognize him?" Danny studied the image. "Should I?" "Vincent Torino. He's been on our radar for years. Runs a construction company that's won suspiciously lucrative contracts with at least 15 HOAs across the state. Your neighbor lady wasn't just stealing, she was part of a criminal enterprise." Danny felt a chill run down his spine. "How deep does this go?" "Deep enough that you're now a federal witness in a major racketeering case. Deep enough that Vincent Torino's people have been asking questions about you since yesterday." The conference room door opened and another agent entered, older, graying, with the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much. "Morrison. I'm Agent Frank Russo. We need to talk about your safety." "My safety?" 3 hours ago, Vincent Torino's nephew was spotted in your neighborhood. Yesterday, a man fitting his description was asking Margaret Henley's neighbors about your routine. We think they are trying to assess whether you're a threat." Danny's blood ran cold. "What kind of threat?" "The kind that makes people disappear." Russo's voice was matter-of-fact. "You've stumbled into something bigger than HOA politics. These people have killed to protect their operation." Meanwhile, across town, Margaret Henley sat in her pristine living room, her hands shaking as she dialed a number she'd hoped never to use again. "Vincent. It's Margaret. We have a problem." Vincent Torino's voice was silk over steel. "I heard. Some retired accountant is making noise. It's worse than that. He's FBI. Former FBI. He knows about the money, Vincent. He knows about Riverside construction." A long pause. "How much does he know?" "Everything. Bank records, fake invoices, all of it. He's been building a case for weeks. And you decided to start a war with him by filling his pool with concrete. Jesus Christ, Margaret, what were you thinking?" Margaret's voice cracked. "I thought he was just another suburban nobody. How was I supposed to know he was a federal agent?" "Because it was your job to know. You were supposed to keep your head down, process the payments, and stay invisible. Instead, you went nuclear on the one person who could destroy us all." "Vincent, please. There has to be something, there is. But you're not going to like it." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're going to fix this. Tonight. And if you don't, I'll fix it myself." The line went dead. Margaret stared at her phone, her reflection ghostly in the black screen. Outside, she could hear the rumble of heavy machinery from Danny's yard. The excavation had been going on for hours, and with each passing minute, the scope of the disaster was becoming clearer. Her doorbell rang. Margaret's heart lurched. Had Vincent already sent someone? But when she peered through the peephole, she saw a woman in a business suit, looking official but not threatening. "Mrs. Henley. I'm Linda Santos from Channel 7 News. We are doing a story about the infrastructure crisis in your neighborhood. Could we talk?" Margaret's mind raced. The media. If this became a news story, Vincent would blame her for the exposure. But if she didn't talk, they'd investigate on their own and might discover even more. She opened the door, forcing a smile. Of course. Please, come in. Linda Santos was younger than Margaret had expected, with the kind of polished aggressiveness that came from climbing the local news ladder. She accepted Margaret's offer of coffee and settled into the living room with her cameraman. Mrs. Henley, as HOA president, can you tell us how this situation developed? Margaret had prepared for this question. Well, Linda, this is really about one resident's refusal to maintain his property. When the HOA attempted to address code violations, the situation escalated beyond what anyone expected. Code violations that led to concrete being poured into a swimming pool at 3 in the morning. Margaret's smile tightened. Sometimes tough decisions have to be made to protect property values for all residents. And the water main break. Were you aware that Mr. Morrison's pool was built over critical infrastructure? Of course not. If we had known, we would never have authorized the remediation. Linda leaned forward. Authorized by whom? According to county records, no permits were filed for this work. Margaret felt sweat beading on her forehead. Well, as I said, it was an emergency action to protect the community. An emergency action that's going to cost residents over $300,000 in repairs. Some neighbors are saying this feels like retaliation. That's absolutely false. Everything the HOA did was within our legal authority. Linda's next question hit like a sledgehammer. Mrs. Henley, what's your response to allegations that HOA funds have been misappropriated over the past 3 years? Margaret's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. I'm sorry, what? We've received documentation suggesting that nearly $1 million in HOA funds were paid to companies that may not exist. As president, shouldn't you know where that money went? Margaret's world tilted. Danny hadn't just filed a complaint, he'd gone to the media. Oh. I'd have to review our records to comment on specific financial matters. Records that are currently frozen by federal investigators. Margaret stood abruptly. I think this interview is over. Linda Santos smiled. Actually, Mrs. Henley, we're just getting started. We'll be airing this story tonight at 11. Thank you for your time. As the news crew packed up, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Vincent, saw the news van. You have until midnight to fix this, or I fix it permanently. Margaret sank onto her couch, her perfectly ordered world crumbling around her. Through her window, she could see the excavation in Danny's yard had expanded. What had started as a hole around the pool was now a crater spanning 3 properties. Orange cones blocked half the street, and a utility crew was setting up floodlights for overnight work. Her phone rang. It was Todd, her faithful lapdog, and he sounded panicked. Margaret, I just got a call from the FBI. They want to interview me tomorrow morning. They are asking about invoices I signed, about payments to contractors. What do I tell them? Tell them nothing. Lawyer up and tell them nothing. But Margaret, some of those invoices. I mean, I signed them, but I never actually verified the work was done. If they are saying those companies don't exist. Todd, listen to me very carefully. If you say one word to the FBI, I will personally destroy you. Do you understand me? But Todd's voice was already changing, gaining strength. Actually, Margaret, I don't think you're in any position to threaten anyone anymore. The line went dead. Margaret stared at her phone in shock. Even Todd was abandoning her. She walked to a window and looked out at the chaos consuming her perfect neighborhood. The excavation site looked like a bomb had gone off. Residents stood in clusters, pointing and talking. She could see the anger in their body language, the way they gestured toward her house. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from her sister in Atlanta. Maggie, just saw your neighborhood on the news. Are you okay? Call me. Margaret closed her eyes. If this was making national news, Vincent would consider her a liability. And Vincent didn't tolerate liabilities. She picked up her phone and dialed Danny's number. Danny, it's Margaret. We need to talk. I have nothing to say to you. Please. Face to face. Just 5 minutes. After what you did. Not a chance. Danny, listen to me. You're in danger. We are all in danger. The people I've been working with, they are not just white-collar criminals. They are killers. There was a long pause. Are you threatening me, Margaret? I'm trying to save your life. And mine. Meet me at the construction site in 10 minutes. If you don't, we're both dead by morning. Danny hung up without answering. Margaret stared at her reflection in the dark window. In 12 hours, she'd gone from neighborhood queen to federal fugitive. Her embezzlement scheme was exposed, her media reputation was destroyed, and now she was caught between the FBI and a violent criminal organization. She grabbed her car keys and headed for the door. If Danny wouldn't listen, she'd have to find another way to survive the night. But as she stepped onto her porch, she saw something that made her blood freeze. A black sedan was parked across the street, its engine running. Through the tinted windshield, she could make out the silhouette of a man watching her house. Vincent hadn't waited until midnight. Margaret backed toward her door, but it was too late. The sedan's doors opened, and 2 men in dark suits started walking toward her. She recognized the larger one, Vincent's nephew, Tony Torino. He had the evacuation sirens wailed across Willowbrook Estates like banshees announcing the apocalypse. Danny Morrison stood behind the police barricade, watching his neighborhood transform into something from a disaster movie. The excavation crater had become a burning pit of hell, fed by ruptured gas lines and spreading through the underground utility tunnels like the devil's own circulatory system. Mr. Morrison. Agent Chen grabbed his arm, her voice barely audible over the chaos. We need to move you to a safe location. Now. What about the other residents? They are being evacuated to the community center. But you're a federal witness. In protective custody as of right now. Danny looked back at the inferno consuming his street. 3 houses were now fully engulfed, their windows exploding in showers of glass that caught the firelight like deadly confetti. The fire had spread faster than anyone had anticipated, jumping from house to house through the underground gas lines that Margaret's concrete truck had compromised. Jesus Christ, Danny muttered. How many people are trapped? Agent Chen's face was grim. We are about to find out. Across the street, Margaret Henley crouched behind an overturned car with Tony Torino, both of them choking on the toxic smoke that now blanketed the subdivision. The explosion had thrown them clear of the initial blast, but they were trapped between the advancing fire and the federal agents who had surrounded the area. This is your fault, Tony wheezed, his expensive suit torn and singed. Uncle Vincent's going to have your head for this. Margaret laughed bitterly. In case you haven't noticed, we're about to be barbecued. I don't think Vincent's going to be a problem anymore. But Tony was already on his phone, shouting over the sirens. Uncle Vincent. We are pinned down in the subdivision. The whole place is going up. Even from her position, Margaret could hear Vincent's voice screaming through the phone, get out of there. Leave the woman and get out. Tony looked at Margaret with the cold calculation of a shark. Nothing personal, lady, but you're a liability. He stood up and started moving toward the police line, hands raised. Margaret watched in horror as he abandoned her, walking calmly through the smoke toward the federal agents. Within moments, she saw him talking animatedly to Agent Chen, pointing back toward the fire. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Tony was making a deal. He was trading information about Vincent's operation for immunity, and she was about to become the scapegoat for everything. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Margaret, this is Linda Santos from Channel 7. We are going live with the story in 30 minutes. If you want to tell your side, meet me at the evacuation center. This is your last chance. Margaret looked at the burning hellscape around her, then at the federal agents who were now searching for her with thermal imaging equipment. She had maybe 10 minutes before they found her hiding spot. She made her choice. The Willowbrook Community Center had been transformed into a disaster relief station. Red Cross volunteers handed out water and blankets to evacuated residents, while paramedics treated smoke inhalation and burns. The local news crews had set up outside their satellite trucks, creating a second ring of chaos around the primary disaster zone. Linda Santos was doing a live stand-up when Margaret appeared at the edge of the crowd, her hair singed and her designer clothes torn. Linda's eyes widened. This was the break she'd been hoping for. "Mrs. Henley. Over here." Margaret pushed through the crowd of evacuees, many of whom recognized her, and began shouting accusations. "You did this. Our homes are gone because of you. Murderer." Linda grabbed Margaret's arm and pulled her toward the news van. "We are going live in 2 minutes. This is your chance to tell the truth." Margaret looked back at the orange glow on the horizon where her neighborhood used to be. "The truth? The truth is I've been an idiot. But I'm not going down for this alone." "What do you mean?" "I mean Vincent Torino and his people have been running a criminal empire through HOA boards across the state. I was just a small part of it. But I kept records, Linda. I kept everything." Linda's eyes lit up. "What kind of records?" Margaret pulled a flash drive from her pocket. "Bank transfers, meeting recordings, contracts, payoff schedules. Everything Vincent ever told me to do, I documented. I may be a thief, but I'm not stupid." The camera operator gave Linda a countdown. In 30 seconds, they'd be live on every major network in the state. "Mrs. Henley, are you ready to confess to embezzlement on live television?" Margaret looked at the camera, then at the crowd of her displaced neighbors. "I'm ready to confess. To a lot more than that." The red light came on. "This is Linda Santos with Channel 7 News, and I'm here with Margaret Henley, the HOA president, at the center of tonight's disaster. Mrs. Henley, what do you want to say to the people who've lost their homes?" Margaret looked directly into the camera. "I want to say that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for stealing from the HOA, I'm sorry for destroying Danny Morrison's pool, and I'm sorry for starting a chain of events that led to this disaster. But I'm not sorry for what I'm about to do." She held up the flash drive. "This contains evidence of a criminal conspiracy that involves dozens of HOA officials, municipal contractors, and organized crime figures across Florida. Vincent Torino and his associates have been systematically looting community funds for years, and I was their inside person in Willowbrook." Linda could barely contain her excitement. "Are you saying this goes beyond your neighborhood?" "I'm saying that Vincent Torino's organization has stolen millions of dollars from communities across 3 counties. They've bribed officials, threatened residents, and murdered people who got in their way. And I have proof of all of it." The camera zoomed in on Margaret's face. "But here's what Vincent doesn't know. I've been recording our conversations for 3 years. Every order, every threat, every payment, it's all here. And as of right now, I'm turning it over to the FBI." In the Disaster Command Center, Agent Chen was watching the broadcast on a tablet. "Jesus Christ," she muttered. "She's just thrown the entire organization under the bus." Agent Russo looked up from a map of the fire zone. "Can we use this? If it's authentic, it's the break we've been waiting for. We can roll up the entire network." But their celebration was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, they could see a black SUV speeding toward the community center, its occupants clearly armed. "Vincent's people," Chen said. "They are coming for her." Back at the news van, Margaret was still talking, her voice gaining strength with each revelation. Vincent Torino ordered the intimidation of at least 6 residents who questioned HOA spending. He had 2 people beaten and 1 woman, Mrs. Patricia Valdez from Sunset Hills. She disappeared after threatening to expose their operation. Linda was frantically taking notes. "Are you saying Vincent Torino is responsible for murder?" "I'm saying that when Patricia Valdez threatened to go to the FBI, Vincent told me he was going to handle the situation permanently." She was reported missing 2 days later. Her body was never found. The sound of screeching tires interrupted the interview. Margaret looked up to see the black SUV sliding to a stop 50 yards away. Four men in dark suits were getting out, and she recognized Vincent Torino himself. In the passenger seat. "Linda," Margaret said quietly, "I need you to promise me something." "What?" "If something happens to me, make sure that flash drive gets to the FBI. And tell Danny Morrison that I'm sorry. Tell him I know it doesn't make up for what I did, but I tried to do the right thing at the end." Linda looked confused. "What are you talking about?" But Margaret was already walking away from the van, toward the approaching men. The crowd of evacuees parted before her like the Red Sea, sensing the violence that was about to unfold. Vincent Torino was a small man, but he radiated menace like a nuclear reactor. His carefully groomed appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from the chaos of the evening. When he spoke, his voice was silk wrapped around a razor blade. "Margaret, you've been a very bad girl." "Vincent, I was wondering when you'd show up. Did you really think you could betray me on live television and just walk away?" Margaret smiled, and for the first time in months, it felt genuine. "I'm not walking away, Vincent. I'm standing my ground." Vincent's three associates had spread out, forming a semicircle around her. Margaret could see the bulges under their jackets, could feel the weight of their stares. The news cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment. "You just signed your own death warrant," Vincent said. "Maybe. But I also signed yours." Vincent's confident smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" Margaret held up her phone. "I've been recording this conversation too. Just like I recorded all the others. Every threat, every order, every confession. It's all being live-streamed to the FBI." Vincent's face went white. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" "Check your phone, Vincent. I sent you a text 5 minutes ago. It contains a link to a cloud storage account with enough evidence to put you away for life. By now, the FBI has access to everything." Vincent pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. The text was there, and the link was real. As he clicked on it, his face went from white to gray. 3 years of recordings, Vincent. Bank transfers, meeting transcripts, murder confessions. I may be a thief, but I'm not stupid. I knew this day would come. The sirens were getting closer now. Margaret could. 6 weeks later, the Willowbrook disaster had become a national symbol of HOA corruption gone wrong. The crater where Danny's pool used to be had been transformed into a memorial garden, paid for by the $2.3 million settlement from Vincent Torino's seized assets. But the real transformation was happening in courtrooms across the country. Margaret Henley sat in the witness chair of Federal District Court, her hands folded in her lap, facing a gallery packed with reporters, victims, and federal prosecutors. The woman who had once ruled her neighborhood with an iron fist now looked small and tired, her bleached hair grown out to show gray roots, her designer clothes replaced by a simple navy suit. "Mrs. Henley," Prosecutor Janet Walsh began, "you've provided testimony that has led to the indictment of 47 individuals across 6 states. Can you tell the court why you decided to cooperate with federal authorities?" Margaret looked out at the gallery, her eyes finding Danny Morrison in the 3rd row. He'd been subpoenaed to testify, but more than that, he'd chosen to attend every day of the trial. Their eyes met, and she saw something she hadn't expected, not forgiveness, exactly, but understanding. "Because I was tired of being afraid," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "For 3 years, I lived in fear of Vincent Torino and his associates. I was afraid they'd hurt me if I didn't cooperate, afraid they'd kill me if I tried to leave. But on the night of the fire, I realized that fear was going to destroy me anyway. So I chose to fight back." Prosecutor Walsh approached the witness stand. "Mrs. Henley, let's talk about the scope of this conspiracy. Based on your knowledge and the evidence you've provided, how many communities were affected?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Conservatively, over 200 HOAs across Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. The total amount stolen was somewhere around $40 million over 7 years." A murmur ran through the gallery. The number was staggering, even for a federal courtroom accustomed to large-scale financial crimes. And how many people were directly involved in the conspiracy? Vincent had a network of about 150 people. HOA board members, municipal officials, contractors, enforcers. He called it the community, and he ran it like a military operation. Defense attorney Marcus Reed stood up. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is characterizing conversations she wasn't present for. I'll allow it, Judge Patricia Brennan said. The witness has established her direct knowledge of the defendant's organizational structure. Continue. Mrs. Henley. Margaret nodded. Vincent held monthly meetings at his compound in Clearwater. He'd assign territories, set collection quotas, and deal with what he called problem residents. People who asked too many questions, who challenged the HOA boards, who threatened to expose the operation. What happened to these problem residents? Margaret's voice dropped. Some were intimidated into silence. Others were physically assaulted. At least 6 people were murdered over the 7-year period. The courtroom erupted. Judge Brennan banged her gavel. Order. Order in the court. But Margaret wasn't finished. Vincent kept trophies. In his office, he had a wall of photographs, driver's licenses, actually, of people who had been handled. He showed them to me once, said it was a reminder of what happened to people who got in his way. Prosecutor Walsh displayed a photograph on the courtroom screen. Mrs. Henley, do you recognize this image? Margaret's face went pale. That's Vincent's office. That's the wall I was talking about. And these photographs? Those are the people he killed. Danny Morrison shifted in his seat, feeling a chill run down his spine. On the screen were dozens of driver's license photos, arranged in neat rows like a serial killer's collection. He recognized several faces from the missing persons reports that had been filed across the region over the past few years. Mrs. Henley. Walsh continued, can you tell the court about the night of March 15th, when you confronted Vincent Torino at the evacuation center? Margaret's hands trembled slightly. I knew he was going to kill me. Tony had already told him I was a liability, and Vincent didn't tolerate liabilities. But I also knew that if I was going to die, I wanted to take him down with me. So you live-streamed the confrontation. I set up a direct feed to the FBI's cybercrime division. Everything Vincent said was being recorded and transmitted in real time. When he confessed to the murders, when he threatened to kill me, it was all being captured by federal agents. Defense attorney Reed stood again. Your Honor, this is highly prejudicial. The defendant was not informed he was being recorded. The defendant was in the process of committing additional felonies, Judge Brennan replied coldly. The recording was legally obtained under exigent circumstances. Overruled. Margaret continued. Vincent was so angry about the fire, about the media attention, that he started confessing to everything. He told me he'd personally killed 6 people, that he had judges and state officials on his payroll, that he was planning to expand the operation to Texas and North Carolina. And all of this was recorded. Every word. Prosecutor Walsh turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard testimony about a criminal enterprise that spanned multiple states and destroyed hundreds of communities. But I want you to remember that this case began with one woman's decision to do the right thing, even when it meant risking her life. She turned back to Margaret. Mrs. Henley, you've pleaded guilty to embezzlement and agreed to make full restitution to the victims. You're facing 5 years in federal prison. Why didn't you just take the money and run? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Because I looked at my neighborhood burning, saw my neighbors losing their homes, and realized that I'd become a monster. Vincent Torino made me into a thief, but I chose to become something worse. I chose to be a coward. Her voice grew stronger. But that night, watching Danny Morrison stand up to all of us, watching him refuse to be intimidated or silenced, I remembered what it felt like to have principles. I remembered what it felt like to be brave. She looked directly at Danny. I destroyed his pool because I was angry that he wouldn't vote for my fee increase. I was angry that he questioned my authority. But he was right to question it. He was right to investigate. He was right to fight back. Danny felt tears welling up in his eyes. This wasn't the Margaret Henley he'd known, the petty tyrant who'd made his life hell. This was someone who'd found her conscience in the middle of a war zone. "Mrs. Henley," Walsh said gently, "what do you want to say to the victims of this conspiracy?" Margaret looked out at the gallery, at the faces of people who'd lost their homes, their savings, their sense of security. "I want to say that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for stealing from you, for lying to you, for being part of a system that treated you like marks instead of neighbors. I can't undo what I did, but I can make sure that Vincent Torino and his people never hurt anyone again." She paused, gathering herself. "And I want to say that if you're living in a community where the HOA board seems too powerful, where the finances don't add up, where people who ask questions suddenly move away or disappear, speak up. Find your own Danny Morrison. Because the only way to stop people like Vincent Torino is to refuse to be afraid of them." The courtroom was silent. Even the reporters had stopped typing. Judge Brennan spoke quietly. "Mrs. Henley, you may step down." As Margaret left the witness stand, she passed the defense table where Vincent Torino sat shackled and glaring. He leaned forward and whispered something to her as she passed. Margaret stopped, turned, and looked him in the eye. "Vincent, I'm not afraid of you anymore." She walked back to the prosecutor's table, her head held high for the first time in years. Danny Morrison watched her go, feeling something he hadn't expected: respect. The woman who'd declared war on him had become the weapon that destroyed his enemies. And in the process, she'd found something she'd lost years ago: her soul. But the trial was far from over. Outside the courthouse, news vans from every major network were broadcasting live updates. The Vincent Torino case had become a national symbol of corruption and redemption, and the ripple effects were spreading far beyond Florida. Inside the courthouse, Prosecutor Walsh was preparing for the next phase of the trial. The evidence Margaret had provided was just the beginning. The FBI had spent 6 weeks following every lead, every bank account, every shell company in Vincent's network. What they'd found was bigger than anyone had imagined. The community wasn't just a regional criminal enterprise, it was a prototype for a national organization that had been quietly taking over HOAs across the country. And Vincent Torino, sitting in shackles in a federal courtroom, was just the beginning. The real masterminds were still out there, and they were about to discover that Margaret Henley's confession had lit a fuse that would burn down their entire world. As the court recessed for the day, Margaret walked out into the Florida sunshine, flanked by federal marshals. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't afraid. She was free. But freedom, she was about to learn, came with a price that even she hadn't anticipated. 1 year later, Danny Morrison stood in his rebuilt backyard, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink above the new Willowbrook Memorial Garden. Where his pool used to be, a beautiful fountain now bubbled peacefully, surrounded by plaques bearing the names of Vincent Torino's victims. The inscription at the center read, "In memory of those silenced for seeking truth." The doorbell rang, and Danny wasn't surprised to find Margaret Henley on his doorstep. She looked different, healthier. Somehow. Prison had been hard on her, but something about facing consequences for her actions had given her a peace she'd never possessed as HOA president. "Danny. Thank you for agreeing to see me." "Margaret." He gestured toward 2 chairs on his rebuilt porch. "I have to say, you look good for someone who just got out of federal prison." Margaret laughed, a genuine sound that Danny had never heard from her before. 18 months in minimum security. Honestly, it was the most honest I'd been with myself in years. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the fountain in the distance. "I heard about the book deal," Danny said. "And the documentary?" Margaret nodded. "Netflix wants to option the story. Can you believe that? The HOA wars, how one woman's revenge started a revolution. They want Meryl Streep to play me. Not bad casting. They want Robert De Niro for Vincent Torino. I told them he's too good looking." Danny smiled. The old Margaret would have bragged about Hollywood attention. This Margaret seemed almost embarrassed by it. "You know why I'm really here," she said. "The letter." Margaret pulled a thick envelope from her purse. "It arrived yesterday. From the Justice Department." They want me to testify before Congress about HOA reform legislation. Danny read the letter, his eyebrows rising. They are proposing federal oversight of all HOAs with budgets over $500,000. Mandatory audits, criminal background checks for board members, resident rights protections. They are calling it the Willowbrook Act. Margaret's voice was quiet. Named after our neighborhood. And they want you to be the face of it. They want both of us. The whistleblower and the victim who brought it all down. Danny set the letter aside. What do you think? Margaret looked out at the memorial garden. I think we owe it to the people who died. Patricia Valdez, Robert Chen, all the others. They tried to speak up and were silenced. Maybe if we'd had these protections back then, you'd still be stealing money and I'd still be complaining about algae in my pool. Margaret laughed bitterly. Probably. But maybe other people wouldn't have had to die. Danny studied her face. You've really changed. Prison will do that. Or maybe it was the letters. Letters? From victims? Hundreds of them. People whose HOAs were looted by Vincent's network, people who lost their homes, their life savings. They thanked me, Danny. They thanked me for finally speaking up. Margaret's voice broke slightly. This woman from Georgia, her name was Susan Martinez. Her HOA board stole $300,000 from their hurricane relief fund. When she questioned it, they had her beaten so badly she was in the hospital for 3 weeks. She wrote to tell me that my testimony gave her the courage to testify against her board. That's something to be proud of. Is it? I was part of the problem for 3 years. I enabled everything Vincent did. Danny was quiet for a long moment. You know what I learned as an FBI agent? Sometimes the best prosecutors are former criminals. They understand the system from the inside. You think I should do it? Testify before Congress? I think you should do whatever feels right. But I also think you're probably the only person in America who can explain to lawmakers how these criminal networks really operate. Margaret nodded slowly. The truth is, Vincent's organization was just the beginning. During my testimony, I started getting calls from HOA board members across the country. Apparently, there are at least 6 other networks operating the same kind of scams. Vincent wasn't the mastermind, he was middle management. Danny felt a chill. How big is this thing? The FBI estimates that HOA-related fraud costs homeowners over $1 billion annually. But most of it goes unreported because people are afraid of retaliation or they don't know who to trust. Jesus. The Willowbrook Act could change that. Federal oversight, whistleblower protections, mandatory transparency. It could prevent thousands of people from going through what we went through. Danny stood up and walked to the porch railing. In the distance, he could see the lights coming on in the rebuilt homes of Willowbrook Estates. Most of his former neighbors had moved away after the fire, but new families had moved in, young couples, retirees, people looking for a fresh start in a community that had literally risen from the ashes. You know what's funny, he said. A year ago, I would have said you were the worst person I'd ever met. I was. But watching you stand up to Vincent that night, watching you choose to do the right thing even when it meant risking your life, that took more courage than anything I did as a federal agent. Margaret joined him at the railing. You gave me that courage. Your refusal to back down, your investigation, your determination to fight back, it showed me what integrity looked like. I'd forgotten. They stood together, watching the peaceful neighborhood that had emerged from the chaos they'd created. So what do you say? Margaret asked. Ready to take on Congress? Danny smiled. After everything we've been through, Congress should be afraid of us. 3 months later, the Hart Senate office building was packed as the Senate Judiciary Committee convened hearings on the Willowbrook Act. Margaret and Danny sat side by side at the witness table, facing a panel of senators and a gallery filled with reporters, HOA reform advocates, and survivors of similar schemes across the country. Senator Patricia Kelman, the committee chair, opened the proceedings. This committee has heard testimony about a criminal conspiracy that defrauded homeowners of over $40 million and resulted in multiple homicides. Today, we'll hear from two witnesses whose actions exposed this network and saved countless lives. Margaret leaned into her microphone. Senator Kalman, Senators, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Margaret Henley, and I am a convicted felon. The directness of her opening statement caused a stir in the gallery. I stole $847,000 from my neighbor's HOA funds. I enabled a criminal organization that terrorized communities across the Southeast. I am not here seeking sympathy or redemption. I am here because I have seen how easily these criminal networks exploit the lack of oversight in HOA governance. She gestured to charts displaying Vincent Torino's organizational structure. HOAs control over $100 billion in assets nationwide, yet they operate with less oversight than a small-town city council. Criminal organizations like Vincent Torino's exploit this regulatory gap to steal from homeowners with impunity. Senator James Crawford leaned forward. Ms. Henley, what would have prevented your own criminal activity? Mandatory annual audits by independent firms. Criminal background checks for board members. Financial transparency requirements. And most importantly, whistleblower protections for residents who report suspicious activity. Danny spoke up. Senator, as a former FBI agent, I can tell you that the current system is a criminal's paradise. No oversight, no accountability, and victims who are too afraid to speak up. Senator Kalman nodded. Mr. Morrison, you've reviewed the proposed legislation. In your professional opinion, would these reforms be effective? Senator, these reforms would revolutionize HOA governance. More importantly, they would save lives. The 6 people Vincent Torino murdered were all killed for asking the same question, where did our money go? Margaret added, the Willowbrook Act would ensure that question can be asked and answered without fear of retaliation. The hearing continued for 6 hours, with Margaret and Danny facing tough questions from both sides of the aisle. But by the end, even the most skeptical senators seemed convinced that federal intervention was necessary. 6 months later, President Harrison signed the Willowbrook Act into law in a Rose Garden ceremony. Danny and Margaret stood behind the president as he put pen to paper, creating the most comprehensive HOA reform legislation in American history. As the ceremony concluded, Margaret found herself face-to-face with Patricia Valdez's daughter, Maria, who had flown in from Arizona for the signing. Ms. Henley, Maria said, tears in her eyes. My mother would be so proud. She spent 2 years trying to expose the corruption in our HOA. She died believing she had failed. Margaret embraced the young woman. She didn't fail, Maria. She was just ahead of her time. This law exists because of people like your mother, people who refused to stay silent. Later that evening, Danny and Margaret sat on a bench outside the Lincoln Memorial, watching tourists take photos in the fading light. So what's next? Danny asked. Back to Florida. Margaret shook her head. The Justice Department offered me a job. Consultant on HOA fraud cases. Apparently, there's enough work to keep me busy for the next 20 years. You're going to help prosecute people like you used to be. I'm going to help protect people like you used to be. Danny smiled. From people like you used to be. Exactly. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 former enemies who had become unlikely allies in a fight neither had chosen but both had won. You know, Danny said, if someone had told me 2 years ago that filling my pool with concrete would lead to federal legislation, I would have suggested they seek professional help. Margaret laughed. If someone